Gangzheng She, it's May 3rd, 2023. Welcome to BRI Dialogues. We would like to kick off with an interesting pattern that is shaping and happening in Middle East. Now, the conversations are BRI Dialogues, but while preparing for you, I thought maybe we should add bickering resolution initiative to it as BRI. Because China is really getting involved in the Middle East, and the latest détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran are an interesting new development, but it has been in making. Is China bringing a conditionality to its investments in Middle East and Africa, or to West Asia and North Africa, as Anoush and I would like to call it evermore? Or is this just a business as usual? Or a new term and conditionality for investment along BRI that you guys have to live together before you attract my investment?
Okay, thank you, Ali, and thank you, Professor Tashami. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm very glad to join this BRI dialogue. So I think it is this year, I think 2023, I think is a very interesting moment to discuss not only the BRI but also the China's involvement in the Middle East. I think this is the 10 years after the initiation of the BRI, after President Xi came to power, officially came to power in China. So after a decade, what should we think of or review this project? I think this is a relatively good time to do that. And in particular, regarding your question about China's recent moves, pretty amazing achievements to many experts. I think it is. I think there. We should understand this kind of actions from different perspectives. So to put it in short ways, I will first talk about two main things. I think the first thing is that we should put it into this kind of the grand strategy of China, not just in this kind of building the BRI in the last decade, but also to think about China's response to the Sino-US rivalry. So I think, to me, to put it in a short way, I think China is trying to rebuild this concept of the intermediate zone and trying to persuade as many countries as possible to keep a relatively neutral way between China and the United States. You don't necessarily need to be China's ally. You don't need to follow China's instruction in all the ways, but but China hope that you won't follow the U.S. In all the directions. So I think this is something that China want to create its own framework or banners to show to the other part of the world that China could achieve something, that if you keep some kind of the connections with China, there are benefits than just to siding with the US to decouple from China. So this is the first thing. And the second thing, I think this is amazing that China is creating this kind of a new this is need to be observed in the future, but I think China is trying to set up this kind of new norms, or maybe the new normals, to deal with this kind of conflicts, that without using this kind of a military buildup or deployments of the military power deterrence or military interventions, but use its history of a relatively good reputation to being an honest broker, and also to provide a prospect for economic benefits, that they could bring the former adversaries together on the same table. So I think this is some new practice that need to that international theorists or international analysts need to pay attention to see whether this could work out in the future or in this kind of like a new digital age with this like the returning of the great power competitions, or according to some scholars, to back into the bipolar war or to a multipolar war. So I think this is a very interesting perspective to understand these things.
Gangzheng, that's a very interesting way of packaging, or rather unpackaging, the issues concerned, and I very much warm to your concept of intermediate zones, because I think that is from strategic studies perspective is a very sound notion to raise. Looking at it from Beijing's perspective for a minute, how does China perceive American pressure on its allies in West Asia and the Mediterranean, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Israel, Egypt in particular, the four countries that America has built these alliances with, and the very four that China is very much focused on, right? How does China perceive American pressure on these countries, and how does it, in a sense, mitigate those pressures? Because we seem to assume things about China, what it thinks more than it does, but we don't really quite know how it perceives America's actions in these critical areas.
Okay, so I think Professor Tishami just raised a very, very interesting question that also this is a very important, the core of the fierce debate among the Chinese scholars, not only in Beijing, but also in other important institutions here in China, about how should China, or how should we perceive the intention or the capabilities of the United States in these regions. So some scholars would say that it is inevitable that in the future, that in the end, China will have a direct confrontation with the U.S. So we should also like have this tick for tack strategy to move against the United States, not only in Indo-Pacific, but also in the Middle East, to watch closely whatever US do, and we should use whatever we have to have these countermeasurements. But some scholars or observers or political advisors, they will say that it is very important to understand that to the west of the Malacca Strait, that China has totally different scenarios that could engage with the U.S. than in the West Pacific. That in West Asia or Africa or Europe, in essence, China doesn't have this kind of like existential conflict of interest with the United States. So China should see what could do to some extent to cooperate with the U.S. and to see whether this could be an interesting leverage that reverse or at least stop the tide, that the worsening relations between China and the United States. Maybe China could work with the United States on some aspects in the Middle East, and then to gradually rebuild the mutual trust, and in some way like that. So I think to Beijing, I think it is also in the past 4 or 5 years, and I will argue also until now, it has been in a little bit like it is in this kind of like a dilemma situation, that it cannot like with confidence to determine like what is the real purpose of the United States and what is the most appropriate response to deal with it. So I think China was like for the last half a decade, or for the last decade, was like to watch what are the pressures, what are the level or the intensity of the US to give this kind of pressure to the local countries, in which directions, in which fields, and what are the response of the local countries, and decide what to do. I will say that I think this is my personal observation. I think that China was, it is to Beijing's surprise that the local countries, I mean the Middle Eastern countries, most Middle Eastern countries, didn't like follow the U.S. and didn't follow the U.S. instructions or give in to the pressures so easily. And especially, I think, after the Ukraine war, the Russia's war in Ukraine, that we can see that the regional countries has little enthusiasm to join this kind of like a blockade or sanctions against Russia. So this gives China another kind of like confidence that they could or it could invest more energy or capitals, political capitals, including to this kind of like regions. And we can also see that in the past few years that in the issues about the 5Gs, about Huawei, about this kind of like a trade, about all kinds of like high-tech cooperation, this kind of like energy cooperations, there has been this kind of like the denial from the local countries against the US pressures. So I think this is a very important phenomenon that China pay attention to.
Right. That's a really interesting insight, Gangzheng. You are familiar, like with the rest of us, regarding the polarization of views about China, particularly in the United States, and that the prevailing conditions are pushing public opinion further and further toward hardening their positions with regard to China, which is, some would argue, affecting America's decision making about China in other places. You mentioned, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and such like. But are you implying that the same debates in China are perhaps going in a different direction? That in China there is a degree of maybe surprise, but pleasant surprise, that America's allies are responding positively to China's soft power, for want of a better term, and that therefore the same pressures that have built up around the White House do not exist around the decision-making circles in Beijing, that they're much more comfortable in trying to deal with America's allies and not seeing those as potential hostile actors.
Yes, I think this is the to some extent this is the case. I think that China for China I think in the relatively early stage of this kind of like a trade war between or the intensification of the great power rivalry between China and the United States, the China's original preference is to directly deal with the U.S. And we can see the early, like the phase one trade deal between Xi and Trump and something like that. And China want to exert some kind of like influence to help build this kind of like connections between North Korea and United States, on and on. And China try to have this kind of like direct conversations and designs between Beijing and Washington. But I think for now, the issue of China is that they are very skeptical about the capability of the White House to make the actual like decisions and also implement such kind of like decisions. I think this is the general atmosphere in the decision making bloc in Beijing, that I think that they will think that after all this kind of like years of talks, this round of like discussions, but every time they seems to reach some kind of like consensus, then there will be something bad happens, and then they will go into another round of this kind of like worsening circles. So I think for now, China has this kind of like shifting its focus and just to try to build this kind of like intermediate zone, and particularly we can see that in the Middle East, that no matter what the US would do, I will focusing on trying to secure that these countries won't decouple from me, and this is the priority for China to do for now. So I think China has this kind of like understanding that, in particular regarding the Middle East. I think this is from my own research based on the previous cases. I think China has always have this kind of like conceptions in mind or notions in mind that the United States won't easily let the Middle East go out of control, like to be in the complete chaos. That United States would do its best to keep it in at least in the orderly in a way, although with some tensions, although with many conflicts, although with bloodshed, but at least in a relatively stable status. But the U.S., due to its own limitations, both inside and outside, cannot bring about genuine peace to this kind of like a region. So China showed like a little enthusiasm to join the US-led international efforts, like in the past 2 decades. So, but in the past, China also lacked the capabilities to create its own forums or platforms to promote the regional stabilities in its own visions. But for now, as we can see for now, that China has this kind of like capabilities. So it's like moving forward with the example of this kind of like a Saudi Iranian China trilateral deals.
That is very interesting. Now, you have done a great extensive work on Arab-Israeli conflict, the region, and when it comes to developing these intermediate zones, Anush was so articulately bringing out Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, and UAE. But within that context, this great power competition among many of those scholars and experts like yourself and Anush and others, there's this talk that both parties feel that they are in a Cold War type that has moved to the Third World War. Some think tanks are even talking about it, but they haven't come out of the closet per se, geopolitically. They're in denial. And the key question is that given that ironclad relationship between Israel and the United States, and the role that Israel plays in West Asia or Middle East for that matter, or Mediterranean basin, can China really count on Israel to be in an intermediate zone as well? Or is that something of a daydreaming? And if that is not the case, how big of a challenge that could be for China for containing, maintaining, and expanding this intermediate architecture in West Asia and North Africa?
Okay, so I think this is also a very critical issue about what is the role of Israel in this kind of like the Middle East regarding the China's involvement in this region. So I think there are different kind of like perspectives that we could talk about this kind of like issue. So I think that when I look into David Ben-Gurion, the founding fathers of Israel, his memoirs, I find a very interesting quotes from him that I think this is after his retirement, but he still had this kind of like huge influence on Israeli politics. And at that time, it was like I think in the late 1960s, that China was like holding the banner of against Israeli aggression against the Arabs, against this kind of like Zionism or this kind of like things. And most Israelis will think that China was like want to see that China want to see the destruction of Israel and has this very genuine aspirations to allow the Arabs to push the Jews into the seas. But Ben-Gurion said it is not true, that China doesn't have a particular or even this kind of like genuine intentions to wreak damage on Israel. But in China's this kind of like a grand design at the time, although it is in this kind of radical years of the Cultural Revolution, the destruction of Israel might suit China's interest better in its competition with the Soviet Union for this kind of like a leadership of the Third War and the World Revolution. So I think we could not say, although China for now and after the Cultural Revolution, China has made clear that it respects the sovereignty of the Israel and the national rights of all the people in the Middle East in this way, and have a good this kind of good relations with Israelis and the Arabs and other like the Iranians and Turkey. At the same time, I think this is a very interesting moment to see that nowadays Israel was put into a secondary place in Beijing's Middle East strategy, because I think it is most important thing for China to make sure that there will be no conflict or this kind of violent clash in the Gulf region. So I think this is the China's most important focus right now. And I think this is my point of view, that China, I think, by foster or by facilitating this kind of like a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, it actually reduced this kind of the risk that Israelis will have this kind of like a risky attempts to attack Iran directly. So it will make the Israeli leaders to have a second thought about this kind of like move. So although I would say that maybe this will reduce this kind of like the options of on the Israeli side, but actually for now it help stabilize the region. So this is something that that I think that the scenarios that we can see between the place of Israel played in China's grand strategy to the Middle East. But I think on the other hand, Israel is also a very important actors in the region. And China, as I think in the past few years, I also argued in different kind of like venues, both inside China and outside China, I would say that China should never like lose like its connections with Israel. Should never go too far to have a bad relation with Israel, because Israel, as you mentioned, is a very special allies or special partners with the United States. So the Israel's behavior or Israeli stance is that Israel's approach to China will have a very important will be a very important examples for other U.S. allies. So I think China will still need to say that if we can hold this kind of like a friendship with even with the Israelis, that we can have better kind of like bargaining or have more ways or space of movements with other U.S. allies. So this is, I think, we should see it in both ways.
Gangzheng, this is fascinating analysis that you're presenting us with, but that also what you're saying shows up the potential pitfalls that China needs to be conscious of, the kind of pitfalls that has sucked in the United States and Europeans before America in getting caught up in the intricacies of conflict in this region. So, by way of example, of course, the reaction to Beijing's brokering of the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement was that has now severed the Abraham Accords, which was going to normalize Israel's relations with more Arab countries, in particular Saudi Arabia. That there is a view that China's intervention, though not deliberately designed to do this, has now isolated Israel even more, has put a further distance between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is probably something that Israel and America wanted, and therefore could potentially make Israel more aggressive towards Iran, which is another of China's close partners in this area. And that as Israel responds by expanding its ties in Azerbaijan, in Turkmenistan, in the UAE, and so on, that those are probably an indirect response to China's interventionism in this region. That the danger is that China might find itself in hot water that it simply cannot manage. Is that a perception that is shared there? What do you think yourself?
Okay, so I think that it is very true to point out the different possibilities or scenarios. That on the one hand, that by making this kind of like a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, it might postpone or stop Israel's attempts to attack Iran, but it also might have this kind of like to stir up this kind of the regional tension. So I think this could happens. We should never eliminate this kind of like possibility. I totally agree with you in this regard. And I think that China's for now talking about this kind of like the possible repercussions or the possible results of this kind of like this peace deal, I think China for now is still relatively keeping its balancing strategies, and it's still do not want to get too deeply into this kind of this mass of like waters. So I was asked before that whether China would do something if this peace deal like falls apart or one part like violate this kind of like peace deal, whether China would do something definitely to save this like peace deal. I personally speaking, I cast doubt on this kind of like prospects. I would say that China will still keep its own way of dealing with the foreign governments, not to point fingers on to one side to say that, oh, you are the one that trying to violate these deals or to break these deals, or to say that someone is trying to destroying this kind of like deals, but trying to still get people around and to show them that if you have this kind of like a dialogue and peace deals, what might be the prospect that we can offer and the whole region can offer to you. I think this is the way that China would do, would not easily like leaving this kind of like behind. So this is for one thing. And for the other thing regarding this kind of the intersections or the conflicts between the Abraham Accords and this kind of like trilateral peace deals, this is what I think of the regional situation, that while China is trying to having this kind of like a balancing acts among the Middle Eastern players, all this kind of like a Middle Eastern players, they are all going this kind of the same way to having this kind of like a balancing strategies. They are trying to cooperate with one power, whether it is intra-regional power or the extra-regional power in one way, but will cooperate with the others on the other fields. So I think this is, I think the GCC countries as a whole and Saudi Arabia in particular, and also including UAE and other Gulf countries, they will also try to keep the good relations with all the parties, and to make sure even that there is a direct conflict between Israel and Iran, they will have the least damage from this kind of like bloodshed. So I think this is that they were going to do. So I don't think that if they if there is when there is no sufficient basis for this kind of like a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and then Saudi Arabia like hurry up to have this kind of like diplomatic relations with Israel, and then everything will be fine, and there will be no Arab-Israel conflicts, and there will be only the Iran versus everyone else. So I don't think this will be the scenario that even without this kind of like a trilateral peace deal, I think Saudi Arabia and other countries is still playing this kind of like balancing games with all the players.
I think the region's name, albeit the fact that we like to call it more and more West Asia, as I said, is becoming from Middle East the middle hedge, because they're all hedging in more ways than one. But can I ask you a question? Turkey is a major power, and Turkey's middle corridor has ambitions in and around BRI, and this land disputes between Azerbaijan and Armenia, cutting off Armenia from Iran through that corridor. All of these things have an impact on north-south logistics, corridors, and trade. And this is all, of course, about economy and trade at the macro level. But how long do you think in that context Iran can be perceived as a seal-tight, security and political partner of China? But when can Iran anticipate that, hey, I signed a deal with Saudi Arabia, I'm playing the ball with China, but where is the foreign direct investment coming? Where do you think there will be a wobbly element in assessment of this partnership vis-a-vis China from Iran's optics, if that flow of investment, which has been promised for more than, how many decades now, Anusha? I think more than 2 decades, 3 decades of China's foreign direct investment, will that be a risk in this process? And in that context, if that doesn't happen, will Iran start being a bit, I would say, not committal to maintaining this new détente?
Yes, I think the Iranian perspective, what Tehran think is also very important in this case, and I think in my observation, I think if Iran has the chance, it will also go into this kind of like hedging games. Like we can see that when there was the JCPOA deal, that there has been many kind of like not just the news, but also kind of like rumors that the Iranians are abandoning the China's investments and just like leaning towards the European companies or investments, and then they will kind of like to expel the Chinese companies and personnel there. So it has been all this kind of like rumors and also some kind of like news. So I think that if there were no this kind of like extreme pressure that imposed by Trump, and also this kind of like a deadlock of reviving the JCPOA by the Biden administration, I don't think Iran will actually go this far to having this kind of like a closer connections with not just China but also Russia today. So, but here's the case that we can see that for Tehran, I think it also perceive to share some similarities with the Beijing's perception about the U.S. that even though it can reach some deal with the White House, it is doubtful that how this deal could be implemented, and then how the regional allies of the U.S. will respond or sabotage this kind of like deal. So I think Iran has this kind of like the concerns always in mind, and so we can see it is how it is today. And I think China will actually envisioning this kind of like a triangular cooperative framework with both Iran and Saudi Arabia, or in a broader sense with Iran and the GCC countries, because China has this kind of like the incentive to invest overseas with this BRI framework, and also have this kind of like a productivity capacities trying to move overseas. And on the one hand, that this kind of like GCC countries are welcoming this kind of like technical cooperations with China, and also some kind of like investments from China. And Iran, on the other hand, have this kind of like a huge resolve of human resources. So you might create in the long run, it's a long shot, but you might create a very interesting triangular cooperative framework that Iran will be this kind of like a production center, and this kind of GCC countries will be this kind of like investment center or regional headquarters, and China will have this kind of invest or move some factories to there to promote its sales of products in the Middle East or to Africa and to Europe. So in the long run, this might be the vision that China showed to the partners in the Middle East. So I think this is the visions. And in practice, I think that everyone will see that, especially after Russia's war in Ukraine, that many countries are starting to practice this kind of like the way to level down the percentage of US dollars in its foreign trade systems. So I think China, like China and Saudi Arabia, and also other GCC countries, also may have this kind of ideas to practice some kind of like new ways to deal with Iran, and Iran will decide whether or how far it should go based on the result of this new practice. So I think this is a possible way that, but it also depends on how much pressure the US or other players will exert on this kind of like process. But there's no doubt that all these kind of like the countries are having this kind of like visions in mind.
Yeah, Gangzheng, this is so interesting, so fascinating. So let me spin this a little bit for you then, and say that so currently the absence of JCPOA actually benefits China. Why? For two reasons, I would say. First, because it gives China a free hand in exploring relations with the UAE and Saudi Arabia without having to satisfy the Iranians at the same time. That China can argue, you know what, there are sanctions, what are we going to do? So that's one side. And the other side of it, that so long as Iran is under sanctions, it cannot turn to the West, and therefore it makes China Iran's captive audience. And in a sense, the relationship is solidified in the absence of Iran's ability to open up to particularly European Union countries. So in a sense, this kind of, animated, on life support suits China because it avoids pressure from Iran, carries on developing relations. As we know, the extent of China's relations with the UAE outplay its relations with Iran by a factor of 10 at least. So why should China rock the boat or make waves that would create conditions beyond the current status quo that is able to benefit from?
Yes, I totally agree with you about this. Your observations about the analysis you just put forward, and I think it is very interesting that I think this is like sometimes I will say that it is a little bit ironic to say that the US has put so much energy, money or capital inside the Middle East But in the end, they create not so ideal scenarios there, but more preferable to the, but more suitable for China to navigate through this kind of like a mess. This is a very interesting phenomenon. I think people like many decades later will see this very intriguing episode in China's rise. So I think this is the very objective way, but very interesting. And I think that China, as I mentioned before, is like in a to its surprise, pleasant surprise that it found sometimes it will have this kind of like the benefits in the current situations. And I think that in the previous years, when the JCPOA was people were negotiating for the JCPOA, and then it was in implementation, and then it was like abolished. I think China was like don't have too many incentives to drastically change the way, to change the course. I think this is like in line with the general ideas about China's foreign strategy or foreign policies, and it was like to follow the flow, like to follow the trend. It was like when you are sailing in the river, the most important thing, if you have a small boat, the most important thing is that you know where the trend is going and just follow the trend or follow the flow. I think this is the general mindset of China's Middle Eastern policy after the Cultural Revolution for many decades. But for now, we can see that it was like a changing from the follow the flow to create the flow, or to create the trend, or at least to create some currents. And as we can see that, although we know that there is some kind of like the US pressure on the ground, but we see that the countries, the regional countries have this kind of like incentives to have this kind of like hedging games in or out the regions, but they might lack this kind of like the moment or important steps to better like becoming intermediate zone. So China will push forward on its own hand to push forward to trying to create a more positive way, in at least in China's eyes, that will bring these countries together and to have this kind of like a trilateral peace deals. So I think this is a very specific examples about this change of mindset from follow the flow to this kind of create the flow. I think this is a very important examples.
I wanted to ask you a question in and around this global security initiative and the international rules-based order, which the entire global South is questioning in more ways than one, or having difficulties with, you know, the sense of exceptionalism in it. So is global security initiative basically the second or the third floor above the BRI because it came as a secondary initiative? Or is that going to be actually the foundation, which is now being revealed, that sits under BRI? So from a significance point of view, and putting aside all the investment that has gone into BRI as a trade commerce route initiative by Beijing, if Beijing had to choose between these two in the next 5 to 10 years, regardless of which administration comes to the office in the United States, where is the centricity of focus from where you are sitting in Beijing today and going to be the core area of attention for the policymakers in China? Global Security Initiative or BRI, or together, but which one is the foundation and which one is the secondary or the third floor?
Okay, this is a very interesting questions. That reminds me when the early years after the BRI was raised, that people like say that, oh, this is like too broad, like too ambiguous, like you can include almost virtually like all the countries in the world into this kind of like a BRI, so this is has been some kind of like suspicions about whether it could be actually implemented. But in comparison, we can see that the global security initiative is even broader, right? It is even more ambiguous, if we could use this word. That there has been so many issues, so many players in the world that I think you cannot easily use this kind of like a global security initiative to actually deal with. I think for now, at least for now, the BRI is still more fundamental and more practical strategy for China, while this kind of like global security initiative is more like, to me, I think, more like a tool, at least for now, a convenient tool for rhetoric and to trying to catch this kind of going to this kind of like moral high ground, especially against this kind of like the suspicions of the global South about the West response to the Ukraine war. So I think this is something that China was also trying to wait and see to see whether this kind of like a global security initiative could be put into more cases or to more practice. And if something actually be done, China could claim that, oh, this is the victory of the global security initiative. But if something failed, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. But I think that the BRI still have this kind of like very concrete purpose in it, okay? Because all this kind of like companies, or no matter it is a state-run company or the private sectors, they still have this, always need to have this kind of like concept in mind that they are trying to get profits in this kind of like investments, although they are also trying to fulfill the government's the encouragement or requirements to invest abroad, but they also, as a companies, they still put this kind of profitability as one of the priorities at least. So this is, I think, it has more concrete backgrounds or ground for than this kind of like global security initiative. And also, on the other hand, as I mentioned before, to me, I think China is rebuilding this kind of like an intermediate zone. So I think when the BRI was actually initiative was raised in the very beginning, this might not be the core mindset for Beijing or for its policymakers. It was trying to create more opportunities, in particularly along this line to Europe and Africa as the two most important destinations for China's future rise. But now, in this kind of like background of rebuilding intermediate zones, I think the BRI have this kind of like a very great incentive to move deeper, move forward. So I think for now, I would not say that the BRI and the Global Security Initiative will be totally separated. They will be used like interchangeably sometimes even. But I think that I would still think that China's the bigger focus will be on BRI.
So let's press you a little bit more on regional security in that case, Gangzheng. And I was quite surprised. I am surprised. It may happen still that China has not built on the Iran-Saudi rapprochement to promote its own Persian Gulf regional security framework that it presented 2 years ago, following Russia's ill-advised project as well, that went to the UN but didn't meet much praise or even comment. China, as you know, has followed with its own initiative for regional stability at the very least, let's call it that. Let's not call it regional security framework. It would appear from the outside that building on what China is doing with Iran and Saudi Arabia, that the ground might well be ready for China to say, and here is my ace for creating a whole new security environment that will guarantee stability. Do you think that is deliberate, that China is not doing this? Or is that a very different geopolitical game that China is playing?
Okay, I think this is a very, very critical point that I think people should to think about. I think, to me, I think that China has been raising this concept about, I forgot how to translate it in English, but in general speaking, it's just like the Gulf security platform for dialogues and security, something like that. But as you mentioned, that China doesn't specifically to say that, oh, this is the triumph of this kind of like a dialogue or this forums, and we should move forward all the following events on this kind of like track. So I think this is true for now, and I think the major concerns for China is that there are 2 points. One is that China, for the current situation, doesn't want to put too much stakes on this kind of like a rapprochement, because people would say that there is a relatively high possibility that it would eventually result in a very desirable outcome, although Beijing will hope that it will create a genuine peace in the region, but no one can guarantee that. So if China like to say that, oh, this is our creation, our triumph in building this kind of like a peace deal, and then it falls apart, it will be a damage to China's reputation, and also to the leadership's capabilities. People will cast doubts on China's movements in the future. So this is for one thing. And then the second thing, I think China is trying to keep this kind of like a dialogue or this platform open, and don't want to make it specifically labeled as a made in China product. Because this is very interesting. When I talk with some British and French diplomatic envoys here in Beijing, and we talk about some kind of like the visions about the future stabilities and cooperations about the Gulf. And I once asked them that if China creates something that is like to fostering or facilitating this kind of like the regional peace or stabilities, would the European countries have this kind of like incentive to join or to at least not vote against this kind of like endeavors? And they would say definitely. If so it was actually in Europeans' interest, including the Britain's interest, to have a relatively stable and peaceful Gulf regions. So, but if China's put too like heavy inks or this kind of like the labels, the Chinese labels onto this kind of like efforts, it will immediately or automatically cast doubts from the European countries. So I think, as we can see from this kind of China's very, very cautious actions or movements regarding the Ukraine war, we can see that China's always have this kind of like the European countries in mind. They're trying to make friends with them as much as possible. So I think this is another reason that China don't want to put like too much like propaganda or publicity about its own efforts or labels onto this peace deal.
That's fascinating. You have talked in the past, and I read in one of your pieces that the challenge with US credibility in the region, in Middle East or in GCC or West Asia, is not because of pure power balance, because United States, as we all know, is the strongest force around the world with 850 bases, and China maybe 1 or 2. in Djibouti and the rest, but it's because of the erosion of predictability and commitment, as you put it, which is quite interesting. Is that not influencing and affecting, particularly in a post-Afghanistan world, the intermediate zones, as you rightly said and brought to our attention, to become ever more alluring? And does that not in itself mitigate this sense of, okay, let's unpack and let's run away from Chinese supply chains because United States is telling us? So in a trade pure BRI or even East Asia or Asia Pacific, do you think that this element of non-committal, not predictability is bringing a sense of thinking twice among the Asian countries that have been historical allies of the United States for not decoupling from China? So in other words, this non-committal, non-predictability approach of the United States, as a matter of fact, reinforces intermediate zones policy of China.
Yes, I think this is generally speaking, I think this is true. That I think because in this kind of like for the time being, as we can see, this kind of like a competition between China and the United States, China is definitely for now is on this kind of like a weaker side, because US have this kind of advantage of its US dollar dominance, its airline systems, alliances all over the world, and also have this kind of like unparalleled advantage in many other ways. So China is definitely on this kind of like weaker positions. But I think that it is due to this kind of like the non-committal and this kind of like this kind of like the intentions, this internal indecisions of the United States, the internal squirrels between different the two parties, and also the influence of multiple interesting groups. I think this create, like objectively speaking, that create some kind of like leverage for China to persuade like more countries to stay in the media zones between the China and the United States. But on the same time, I should say that there is not just the Sino-US relations in the world. It is the relations between China and the United States is important, but many other countries will always have their own priorities in the near borderland or in the faraway overseas markets. So I think that they will always trying to have this kind of like intention or this kind of inclination to have this kind of like a hedging strategy. And this is due to the what we call the special features of the new Cold War between China and the United States in comparison with the Cold War 1.0 between the Soviet Union and the United States. This is some kind of like in direct contrast the features of these two great power competitions. This is on the one hand, and the other hand, this I think it is due to the features of our own times. This is, I think, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. They are still largely in this kind of like the late stage of industrial age. Okay, and then but now we are on at least in the early phase of the digital age. That means there will be more and more materials that you could have multiple choices. You could choose from different providers. You could have this kind of like probabilities. For example, I will always use this kind of like examples. For example, the GCC countries or the Middle Eastern countries, they could use this kind of like the Huawei 5G network, but like to run software that developed by the Israeli like a company, but also store this kind of like data on Apple like service, right? They could use use different kind of like combinations. And this is, I think this is very different from what we see in the last Cold War, that you must follow the Soviet version of communism or the US version of capitalism. You must put all this kind of like resources in your country to follow this path in basic speaking. So I think this is a very different scenarios nowadays.
So fantastic. And that brings us full loop into, in that world of, you know, multipolarity and multi-connectivity and digital, analog, and the rest of it, what would be your single most important piece of advice for the cinephobes and the cinephiles, if you were to leave them with one piece of advice today?
I would say that to come to China, and especially like with the opening after the pandemic, I think whether you like have a positive view of China or a negative view of China, I will suggest you and hope you could come to visit China in person to have this kind of like a face-to-face dialogues with the Chinese people or the Chinese scholars or other people. I think that will largely decrease your delusions, no matter what kind of views you have about China. And this will create the predictability and stabilities when you're dealing with China and all other players in the world.
Gangzheng, that is really profound statement on which to end. By the way, for the record, I should say that I don't buy into Ali's analysis of America somehow decoupling, delinking. It is restructuring. I don't believe that America is for a moment packing his bags and leaving the region. But that's a discussion for another time. For now, though, Gangzheng, it is my deep and real pleasure to thank you for having joined us on BRI Dialogues, and also for bringing from within Chinese scholarly and policy circles perspectives that hopefully be fresh to our viewers and our listeners. There is a huge degree of realistic, recognizable sets of issues that you've tackled with us. There is consistency in what you've said. There is no hint of hegemony, rivalry, competition, and such like, but actually explaining the broader contours of what happens when new global powers emerge and then begin to exercise their policies, their influence, and in the case of China, now more than ever, their immense soft power. I'm of the view that the Saudi-Iranian deal that President Xi Jinping brokered would not have happened if China was bristling its weapons. It's only happened because it has huge economic leverage in both of these countries. And not just leverage, but also it is such that those countries also recognize the importance that China offers as a major trading, investment, Asian power for these countries. And you've shed light on the importance of this. It's not that China is better, China first, but it's about a realistic understanding of what China is all about, where it is, and how it is growing and unfolding its repertoire of engagements around the world, in particular in West Asia and North Africa. So Ali and I are immensely grateful that you've joined us, but also for the way in which you've made the discussion come alive with your terminologies and your analysis. So we are very grateful to you, Dr. She, for having done this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. So I would say that I really observations, your analysis regarding what you just mentioned. I think that this kind of like the peace deal was a creature like combined with intentional and unintentional like moves, and maybe we are witnessing this kind of like a new possible norms to create a more genuine peace in the region, because the past efforts provide the lessons in both ways, in the good ways and in the bad ways. So I think this might create something that for our scholars to observe and to analysis. And also I will say that it is my privilege to be here, to be with you and Ali. And I know of your name for many years. It is great honor to meet you in person, although still virtually, but I hope to meet you physically face to face soon. And your articles and your books are great inspirations to me. I still remember when I was a graduate student many years ago, I read the book you edited. I think it is Foreign Policies of the Middle Eastern States. I think this is a very seminal work to my endeavor in this path of Middle Eastern studies. So thank you for your inspirations.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
It's very good of you to say. I think we need to celebrate our partnership when I'm in Beijing next.
Okay.